Welcome to my Boring History Sleep channel. Today, we dive into the fascinating story of what happened after the Black Death ended, exploring how society, culture, and humanity itself transformed in the aftermath of one of history's most devastating pandemics. So, get comfortable, relax, and let the journey into the quiet echoes of the past guide you to sleep. The Black Death, one of the most catastrophic events in human history, touched every corner of Europe. Its shadow stretched over towns, villages, and cities, leaving streets quiet where laughter once echoed, homes empty where families had lived, and fields untended where farmers had worked. It was a time of unimaginable loss, a period where life seemed fragile and death constant. When the plague finally began to recede, people found themselves in a world that was both familiar and startlingly new. The devastation had created a landscape transformed not only physically but socially and emotionally. The air that once carried the hustle and bustle of market towns now seemed heavier, laden with the memory of those who had been lost. Yet, even amidst grief, life persisted, and the survivors began the delicate work of rebuilding, of finding ways to live again in the aftermath of so much suffering. It is difficult to imagine the quiet streets immediately after the plague. Villages that once teemed with activity had been reduced to hushed corridors where only a few remained. The emptiness was both somber and profound, a silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. Yet, within this silence, there was also a peculiar kind of opportunity. The sudden scarcity of people meant that those who survived were suddenly imbued with a sense of new possibility. Farmers who once labored under strict demands found that their work, though still necessary, carried greater importance. Their skills were in higher demand, their labor more valuable, and their voices, once perhaps unnoticed, began to matter in ways they had never mattered before. Homes and families had been deeply affected. Many households had lost parents, siblings, and children, leaving the survivors to navigate grief that was both intimate and widespread. Yet, even in the midst of loss, communities began to find ways to support one another. People shared food, tended to the sick who remained, and sought to keep the memories of their loved ones alive. There was a quiet, unspoken understanding among neighbors that life, though changed, must go on. Children, some orphaned, were taken in by relatives or by those with the capacity to care for them, creating new bonds that would define the next generation. The economic landscape of towns and villages shifted dramatically. With so many workers gone, labor became a precious commodity. Landowners, once secure in their ability to demand work from peasants, found themselves in unfamiliar territory. They had to negotiate, offering better wages and more favorable conditions simply to ensure that their fields were tended and their estates maintained. Peasants and laborers, for their part, discovered newfound leverage. For the first time in many generations, they could demand fairer treatment, and in doing so, they began to reshape the very structure of rural life. These changes did not happen overnight, nor did they erase centuries of established hierarchy, but they planted seeds that would grow into significant social transformation over time. In cities, the story was much the same. Urban centers had experienced staggering mortality, with markets emptied, workshops abandoned, and streets quiet. The artisans and merchants who remained began to realize that they were suddenly in a position of opportunity. Their skills, their knowledge of trade, and their ability to produce goods were more valuable than ever. Markets slowly revived, as people recognized the importance of commerce and exchange in sustaining the community. Towns that had been on the brink of collapse began to pulse again with activity, though always beneath the shadow of the recent devastation. The psychological impact of the Black Death lingered long after the last fevered cough had passed. Survivors were haunted by memories of those who had died around them. The sight of empty homes, abandoned farms, and quiet streets served as a constant reminder of mortality. People began to think more deeply about the nature of life, about the fragility of human existence, and about the ways in which communities could better protect themselves. This reflection often led to profound changes in personal behavior, social interaction, and even spiritual practice. For many, religion became a source of comfort, a way to process grief and seek meaning in a world that had suddenly seemed so fragile. Religious life, in particular, was transformed. Churches, once crowded and bustling, had seen many of their congregants perish. Clergy who survived were confronted with the immense task of guiding their communities through mourning, reconciliation, and rebuilding. They offered solace through sermons, prayers, and rituals that acknowledged both loss and hope. Pilgrimages became more common as people sought spiritual reassurance and healing, hoping to honor those who had been lost while seeking protection for the living. In this way, faith became both a shield against despair and a bridge toward the future. The arts, too, began to reflect the aftermath of the plague. Painters, sculptors, and writers captured the sense of fragility and impermanence that pervaded daily life. Images of death and decay, of empty landscapes and solemn figures, became common themes, reminding viewers of both the horror of the recent past and the resilience of those who survived. Literature began to explore human vulnerability in ways that were more intimate and reflective, grappling with questions of morality, fate, and the human spirit. These artistic expressions were not merely records of suffering, they were a means of understanding, processing, and ultimately accepting the profound changes wrought by the Black Death. In villages, the rhythms of daily life slowly resumed. Farmers tilled the land, planting crops for the coming seasons. Shepherds tended flocks that had survived the plague, guiding them across fields that had grown wild in the absence of human care. Craftsmen repaired homes, built new structures, and fashioned tools to replace those lost. Markets reopened, though trade was initially slow and cautious. People began to reconnect with neighbors, sharing food, stories, and labor. In these small, persistent acts, the foundations of recovery were laid. The social fabric of communities had been irrevocably altered. With so many deaths, family structures had shifted. Elders, once the central figures of households, often found themselves isolated, their children gone. Siblings became primary caregivers for one another. Cousins, uncles, and aunts assumed responsibilities that had previously been distributed differently. These shifts required adaptability, patience, and resilience, qualities that would define the next generation. Social hierarchies, too, were challenged. Laborers, once subordinate, found themselves in a position of relative power. Nobles and landowners had to navigate these changes carefully, negotiating new social contracts and finding ways to maintain order without provoking unrest. Education and knowledge took on new importance in the post-plague world. Schools and universities, which had lost teachers and students alike, worked to rebuild their programs. The scarcity of learned individuals emphasized the value of knowledge, leading to a renewed focus on scholarship, science, and inquiry. People became more observant, noting patterns of illness, agricultural techniques, and economic trends. This attentiveness, born out of necessity, laid the groundwork for intellectual growth and innovation in the centuries to come. In the realm of medicine, the Black Death had left an indelible mark. Physicians and healers, confronted with the sheer scale of mortality, began to question long-held assumptions and experiment with new approaches. Public health measures, though rudimentary, became more common. Towns implemented quarantines and sanitation practices that reflected a growing awareness of contagion. While medical understanding remained limited, the experience of the plague fostered a cautious respect for prevention and observation, a seed of progress that would influence future generations. Life, in essence, became more precious. Survivors carried with them a heightened awareness of mortality and the fleeting nature of existence. Simple pleasures, a shared meal, a safe night's rest, a successful harvest, were celebrated with greater gratitude. Communities, though forever marked by loss, found ways to embrace hope, to nurture growth, and to cherish connections that might previously have gone unnoticed. In this slow, deliberate recovery, the human spirit proved resilient, capable of adaptation and renewal even after unimaginable tragedy. The end of the Black Death was not a singular moment, but a gradual unfolding, a slow lifting of shadows that had seemed permanent. As the fevered grip of the plague loosened, survivors emerged into a world that demanded both caution and courage. Fields had to be tended, homes rebuilt, and relationships restored. Communities needed to redefine themselves, balancing the memory of loss with the promise of renewal. In this delicate dance between grief and hope, life began to assert itself once more. Through all of this, the human capacity to endure, to adapt, and to rebuild became evident. Those who survived carried the memory of the Black Death not only as a shadow, but also as a lesson. They understood that life was fragile yet resilient, that communities could be broken and yet reformed, that suffering, while profound, could also inspire reflection, growth, and ultimately hope. The world that emerged after the plague was forever changed, shaped by loss, but also illuminated by the quiet persistence of human life. Even as the streets gradually filled with children playing, merchants trading, and farmers working, the imprint of the Black Death lingered. Shadows of grief mingled with whispers of opportunity, and a new awareness of human mortality colored daily existence. Every stone in the road, every seed planted, and every hand extended in kindness carried the memory of what had been lost, and the determination to ensure that life, in all its fragile beauty, would continue. Time, as it always does, moved forward. Villages and cities recovered, and slowly the scars of the past softened. Families formed new bonds, communities strengthened, and the rhythm of daily life reestablished itself. Yet, beneath the surface, the lessons of survival, adaptation, and the preciousness of life remained etched into the fabric of society, quietly guiding humanity toward a future shaped by resilience and cautious optimism. After the Black Death, the economic landscape of Europe underwent changes that were profound, slow, and transformative. The plague had claimed an enormous portion of the population, and this sudden scarcity of people reshaped the very foundations of labor, land use, and trade. For the survivors, the world that emerged was different in subtle and not so subtle ways. Fields that had once been crowded with farmers now had fewer hands to till the soil. Workshops that had hummed with activity were suddenly quiet. The scarcity of labor created a shift in power dynamics, a delicate recalibration in which the value of human effort became more apparent than it had ever been before. In villages, the impact was immediate and tangible. Farmers who had survived found themselves in a position of unprecedented leverage. The demand for labor exceeded the available supply, meaning that peasants could negotiate better conditions and higher wages. Where once they had been tied to the land by feudal obligations, they now had options. Some moved from one manor to another, seeking better treatment or better pay. Others began experimenting with more efficient methods of cultivation, learning to accomplish more with fewer hands. The scarcity forced innovation, encouraging careful planning and new approaches to agriculture that would gradually reshape rural life. Landowners, who had long depended on an abundant labor force to maintain their estates, faced challenges that required adaptation and flexibility. They could no longer assume that labor would be readily available at a fixed cost. In response, many offered incentives such as higher wages, reduced obligations, or temporary freedoms, simply to ensure that their fields were worked. This negotiation was not always smooth. Some lords resisted change, clinging to old hierarchies and expecting peasants to continue their work as before. Others embraced the new reality, recognizing that survival of their estates depended on cooperation rather than coercion. In both cases, the economic shift planted the seeds for social transformation, slowly altering the balance of power between laborers and landowners. Trade, too, experienced subtle shifts. Towns that had relied on large populations for markets now faced reduced demand, at least temporarily. Merchants adjusted to these changes by concentrating on quality rather than quantity, producing goods that were more carefully crafted, more durable, and often more expensive. The scarcity of skilled artisans made their work more valuable, encouraging apprenticeships and training programs to ensure that craftsmanship did not vanish. In some cities, guilds found themselves in positions of unexpected influence, as they controlled access to skilled labor and resources. The economy, though initially disrupted, adapted, demonstrating the resilience and flexibility of human commerce. Money itself took on new significance. With fewer people to serve and fewer goods to produce, the circulation of currency changed. Wages increased for many laborers, who now had purchasing power that had previously been unimaginable. Small shops and market stalls benefited from this redistribution, as peasants could now buy goods they had once only dreamed of affording. In a subtle but profound way, the plague had democratized aspects of the economy. Wealth was no longer confined exclusively to the upper classes. Laborers had a stake in the system that had once seemed immovable. This shift was gradual, imperceptible at first, but it laid the groundwork for future social mobility and economic reform. The scarcity of labor also prompted innovation in agriculture. With fewer hands available to work the land, efficiency became paramount. Farmers experimented with crop rotation, new plowing techniques, and more careful management of livestock. Pastures that had been neglected during the years of the plague were restored, and fields were cultivated with greater attention to yield and sustainability. These changes were not immediate solutions. They required patience, trial, and careful observation, yet over time they contributed to a more productive and resilient agricultural system, one capable of supporting growing populations in the generations to come. In urban centers, the economic transformation was equally significant. The sudden reduction in population meant that many workshops, mills, and small factories had fewer workers. Skilled artisans who survived the plague found themselves in high demand. Their knowledge, honed through years of apprenticeship, became a scarce and valuable commodity. They were able to negotiate better wages and working conditions, and in some cases, to establish their own workshops or guilds, securing independence that had been rare in previous generations. Markets slowly revived, often focusing on luxury goods or specialized items, reflecting the increased purchasing power of the laboring classes. The economic transformation was not solely about money or wages. It was also about opportunity and adaptation. Survivors found themselves in a position to explore new trades, learn new skills, and pursue livelihoods that had previously been closed to them. Many peasants took up crafts or small-scale commerce, supplementing agricultural work with market activity. Cities began to see a gradual diversification of trades, as people responded to the needs of a recovering population. This diversification fostered creativity, resilience, and innovation, laying the groundwork for economic growth that would unfold in the decades following the plague. Social mobility, once rigidly constrained, became more attainable. Peasants who demonstrated skill, ambition, or adaptability could rise in status, acquiring land, resources, or influence. Artisans and merchants could establish reputations that transcended family lineage. The rigid hierarchies of the medieval economy, though still present, became more flexible. The scarcity of labor had disrupted old patterns, forcing society to reevaluate the value of individuals and their contributions. In this quiet but profound way, the Black Death reshaped not only the economy, but also the perception of human worth and potential. The church, too, was affected economically. Many religious institutions had lost members of their clergy and benefactors. Some monasteries and convents faced challenges in maintaining their lands and resources. In response, they adapted, managing estates more efficiently and sometimes leasing land to tenants on more favorable terms. Charitable activities, which had been central to religious life, continued but were tempered by the realities of a changed economy. The interplay between spiritual and economic considerations created subtle shifts in how communities were supported, contributing to the overall transformation of the social landscape. International trade, though temporarily disrupted, eventually resumed with new vigor. Merchants learned to navigate the challenges posed by population loss, developing networks that were more resilient to fluctuations in labor and demand. Cities with strategic locations, such as ports or crossroads of commerce, gained influence as centers of trade and economic activity. The interconnectedness of European economies, though strained by the plague, ultimately strengthened as merchants and rulers alike recognized the benefits of collaboration and exchange. This long-term perspective, emerging from short-term disruption, would prove essential in shaping the economic history of the continent. The aftermath of the Black Death also highlighted the importance of planning and foresight. Survivors learned to anticipate shortages, manage resources carefully, and invest in systems that could withstand future crises. Storage of food, preservation techniques, and careful management of livestock became more critical than ever. These practical adjustments, born out of necessity, contributed to greater stability and resilience. Communities that had survived the plague understood that the security of the future depended on careful attention to the present. Credit and banking systems in some regions began to expand as well. The redistribution of wealth, combined with increased mobility of laborers and merchants, created opportunities for lending, investment, and trade on a larger scale. Financial instruments that had previously been limited to a few centers of commerce became more widespread. These developments, though incremental, laid the foundation for more complex economic systems that would flourish in the centuries to come. Even small changes had long-term consequences. When a farmer could demand better wages, when a craftsman could establish a workshop, when a merchant could explore new trade routes, the ripple effects spread throughout the community. Families gained opportunities that had been denied to previous generations. Villages and towns began to prosper in ways that were previously unimaginable. The Black Death, though catastrophic in its destruction, inadvertently created the conditions for renewed growth, innovation, and adaptation. The psychological impact of economic transformation was subtle but important. Survivors were aware that life had changed irrevocably. They had seen how fragile the old systems could be and how adaptable human society could become. This awareness encouraged caution, but also ambition. People planned with greater care, invested in their skills and tools, and sought security through both labor and trade. The lessons learned in these difficult times shaped attitudes toward work, wealth, and opportunity for generations. Over time, the economic changes contributed to broader social shifts. As laborers gained mobility and bargaining power, traditional feudal obligations weakened. Peasants and artisans were no longer entirely dependent on a single lord or workshop. This relative freedom encouraged experimentation, travel, and exploration of new occupations. The economy became less rigid, more dynamic, and more responsive to individual initiative. These changes, subtle at first, set the stage for profound transformations in society, culture, and governance. Even in the quiet villages, where the rhythm of life seemed unchanged, the effects of economic transformation were felt. Markets reopened with new energy, craftsmen repaired homes, built tools, and produced goods for sale. Farmers experimented with techniques that allowed them to cultivate more efficiently. Children learned trades from surviving adults, ensuring that skills would not be lost. Each act of labor, each transaction, each decision about how to manage resources contributed to the gradual rebuilding of a society that had been deeply shaken by the plague. In cities, the streets that had once been quiet began to hum again, slowly at first, then with increasing vitality. Shops opened, craftsmen displayed their wares, and merchants negotiated deals that reflected the new value of labor. Artisans trained apprentices who would carry knowledge forward into the next generation. The economy was not merely recovering, it was transforming, adapting to the new realities imposed by scarcity and mortality. The balance of power had shifted, and with it, the potential for innovation, creativity, and growth expanded. The economic transformation after the Black Death was not an event that could be measured solely in numbers or transactions. It was a subtle, pervasive, and long-lasting shift in the way humans perceived work, value, and opportunity. Scarcity made labor precious, and that preciousness reshaped the relationships between landowners and peasants, artisans and apprentices, merchants and clients. In this rebalancing, society began to acknowledge the importance of each individual contribution, planting seeds that would bear fruit in centuries of economic and social development. In essence, the Black Death, while devastating, revealed the resilience and adaptability of human communities. Economic structures, once rigid and unyielding, began to bend and flex under the pressure of necessity. Laborers gained leverage, landowners learned negotiation, artisans found new value in their skills, and communities learned the importance of resource management. The scars of loss became the catalysts for change, shaping the trajectory of European society in ways that would resonate long after the plague itself had passed. The survivors moved forward, carrying lessons learned from scarcity, labor, and opportunity. They understood the fragility of old systems, yet also the potential for innovation and growth. They rebuilt homes, cultivated land, and traded goods, each action reinforcing the delicate balance of recovery. Slowly, carefully, life regained momentum. In the quiet rhythm of rebuilding, in the negotiation of labor and wages, in the management of fields and workshops, the seeds of a transformed economy were sown. These seeds, nurtured by necessity and perseverance, would one day grow into the foundations of modern Europe, a testament to human resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. The Black Death did more than change economies or depopulate villages. It transformed the very fabric of society. Families were torn apart, communities disrupted, and social hierarchies challenged in ways that would resonate for generations. The death toll was enormous, leaving behind countless homes without parents, siblings, or children. In the aftermath, survivors faced a world where relationships had been altered, responsibilities shifted, and the ordinary rhythms of life required reevaluation. In this quiet, almost imperceptible transformation, the social structure of Europe began to bend, gradually adjusting to new realities. Villages, once tightly knit clusters of interdependent families, found themselves sparsely populated. Where streets had been lively with the laughter of children, chatter of neighbors, and calls of merchants, there was now silence, interrupted only by the distant sounds of animals or the rustle of wind through empty fields. Survivors walked carefully through this altered landscape, aware that every household had its story of loss. Yet, amidst the grief, there emerged subtle adaptations. Orphans were taken in by extended family members, neighbors shared provisions, and communal labor was reorganized to meet the essential needs of the village. A quiet sense of solidarity developed, born not from obligation, but from mutual dependence and the recognition of shared vulnerability. Families themselves underwent profound changes. The loss of parents left older siblings in charge of households, tasked with responsibilities that they had never anticipated. Young men and women, barely adults, became de facto heads of households, tending fields, managing livestock, and overseeing the work of younger children. Mothers who survived found themselves caring not only for their own children, but also for nieces, nephews, and orphans from neighboring homes. In some cases, the absence of previous hierarchies allowed younger family members more freedom and influence than they had experienced before. Social roles that had been fixed for generations were disrupted, creating opportunities for initiative, decision-making, and personal growth. Marriage patterns also shifted. With a drastically reduced population, there was an imbalance between men and women in many areas. Some widows and widowers remarried quickly, forming households that blended children from multiple families. In other cases, individuals remained single longer than had been customary, pursuing economic or social stability before entering new partnerships. These adjustments were not always orderly or uniform, yet they reflected the pragmatic approach to survival that characterized post-plague communities. People were learning to navigate a world in which previous social norms had been challenged by the sheer scale of mortality. The social hierarchy, once rigid and taken for granted, began to show cracks. Peasants who had been bound to the land found that their labor was now a scarce commodity. Lords and landowners, desperate to maintain productivity, had to offer concessions such as reduced labor obligations, better wages, or temporary freedoms. This shift disrupted long-established power dynamics, giving ordinary villagers greater autonomy and influence than they had previously possessed. The rigid structures of feudalism, though still present, were gradually eroded by necessity. Communities became more flexible, and individuals discovered that their efforts and choices carried weight in ways they had never experienced. Urban centers experienced similar transformations. Cities that had once thrived on dense populations now struggled to maintain their markets, workshops, and services. Survivors, artisans, merchants, and laborers found themselves in positions of leverage. Skilled workers could demand better compensation or more favorable conditions. Guilds, which organized trades and controlled access to professions, gained influence as they regulated who could practice certain crafts. These shifts allowed people to negotiate for fairness and to assert influence in ways that had previously been limited by tradition or hierarchy. In quiet workshops and bustling marketplaces alike, the social landscape was being rewritten, one negotiation and one decision at a time. The distribution of wealth and resources, though subtle, was affected by these social shifts. Many families had lost their primary earners, leaving property and assets to survivors. Widows, orphans, and other dependents sometimes inherited land, tools, or livestock that had previously belonged to deceased family members. In some cases, this redistribution empowered individuals who had once been marginalized, giving them economic leverage and social standing within their communities. The result was a gradual rebalancing of social influence in which personal skill, resourcefulness, and circumstance became as significant as birthright or lineage. Education and apprenticeship, long limited by social rank, gained new importance. With populations reduced, skilled labor became scarce. Young survivors who could learn a trade or acquire specialized knowledge were highly valued. Apprenticeships were offered more widely, sometimes to individuals who had previously been excluded, as families and communities sought to ensure the continuation of essential skills. This increased access to knowledge subtly undermined traditional social barriers, allowing more individuals to participate meaningfully in the economic and cultural life of their communities. Communities also adapted socially in response to shared grief. Public mourning became an important aspect of life, providing a framework for people to process collective loss. Churches organized ceremonies and rituals that honored the dead, while neighbors provided support through acts of kindness and charity. These shared experiences fostered cohesion, even as individual families navigated personal tragedy. In subtle ways, the Black Death strengthened communal bonds by emphasizing interdependence and empathy, reminding survivors that they were part of a broader social network that could offer support and stability. Religious and spiritual life underwent significant shifts as well. Clergy who survived were confronted with congregations depleted by death, many of whom questioned the reasons for such widespread suffering. While some turned to religious devotion for comfort, others challenged established doctrines or sought new interpretations of faith. This period saw a complex interplay between orthodoxy and individual spiritual exploration. Communities negotiated these tensions, balancing tradition with the need for understanding and solace. In doing so, social hierarchies within religious institutions were subtly redefined, with practical knowledge, leadership, and compassion becoming as important as rank or tenure. The psychological impact of the Black Death also influenced social behavior. Survivors were acutely aware of mortality, and this awareness shaped interactions, priorities, and communal structures. People valued life and human connection more deeply, even as they grieved the losses around them. This heightened consciousness encouraged generosity, patience, and cooperation as communities worked together to recover and sustain themselves. Social norms evolved to reflect the need for practical support, emotional care, and shared responsibility, creating a more resilient and adaptive social fabric. Marriage and family alliances, which had long been tools of economic and political strategy, were affected in nuanced ways. The loss of potential spouses and the need for survival sometimes led to unconventional arrangements. Families collaborated to care for children, share resources, or consolidate labor. Widowhood, previously a condition of social vulnerability, could now offer a measure of autonomy and influence, as widows controlled land, labor, or household management. These subtle shifts challenged traditional gender roles and introduced flexibility into social structures that had long been rigid. Migration became more common in the post-plague period, reflecting both necessity and opportunity. Survivors often moved to neighboring villages or towns in search of work, security, or companionship. This movement created new social networks and exposed communities to different ideas, practices, and influences. The blending of populations encouraged adaptation and flexibility. slowly knitting together a social landscape that was more dynamic and interconnected than before. Each individual who moved carried with them experiences, skills, and relationships that enriched the communities they joined. Childhood and education were also affected by social changes. With many adults lost to the plague, children often assumed responsibilities early, learning trades, tending animals, or helping manage households. In some cases, orphans were taken in by other families or institutions, creating new social bonds and networks. Education, though limited, became more focused on practical skills necessary for survival and community contribution. These early experiences shaped a generation that was adaptable, resourceful, and aware of the social importance of cooperation, responsibility, and mutual support. Feudal obligations, which had long structured rural life, were increasingly challenged by necessity. Laborers who had once been tied to a single lord or estate found alternatives and leverage. Some negotiated reduced obligations or better terms. Others moved to areas offering greater opportunity. Lords who wished to maintain control had to adapt, offering concessions and recognizing the value of skilled and willing labor. These negotiations altered the balance of power, subtly undermining feudal rigidity and contributing to a more flexible social order. Urban social life also evolved in response to demographic changes. Guilds and trade associations gained influence as they regulated access to professions, enforced standards, and trained apprentices. These institutions became social as well as economic centers, fostering networks of mutual support and shared identity. Markets and public spaces, though quieter immediately after the plague, eventually revived as hubs of interaction, facilitating social cohesion and exchange. The rhythm of city life adapted to the realities of the post-plague population, balancing necessity with opportunity. Cultural practices and rituals reflected social shifts as well. Festivals, ceremonies, and communal gatherings were shaped by the memory of loss and the need for cohesion. Music, storytelling, and art often carried themes of mortality, resilience, and community. These cultural expressions reinforced social bonds, reminding participants of both shared vulnerability and collective strength. Through these rituals, societies preserved memory, honored the dead, and nurtured continuity, even in the face of profound disruption. In some regions, the shortage of population encouraged new forms of social organization. Village councils, local magistrates, and informal networks of neighbors gained practical authority as communities adapted to changing circumstances. Decision-making, once the purview of traditional elites, sometimes shifted to those with practical knowledge, leadership skills, or the ability to contribute to recovery. This redistribution of influence, while subtle, reflected the necessity of cooperation and the recognition that survival depended on collective action. The psychological and emotional dimensions of social change cannot be overstated. Survivors lived with constant reminders of mortality, yet this awareness fostered reflection, empathy, and a deeper appreciation of human connection. Communities learned to support one another, to share resources, and to navigate grief collectively. In doing so, they developed social structures that were not only resilient, but also more attuned to the needs and capacities of individuals. The tragedy of the Black Death, in its immense scale, paradoxically created opportunities for humanity to understand, value, and nurture its social bonds in new ways. Even as communities slowly rebuilt, social hierarchies remained in flux. Nobles and landowners had to contend with empowered peasants. Clergy had to address congregations whose numbers and needs had changed. Artisans and merchants negotiated new forms of authority. Social mobility, though limited, became more possible. Individuals who demonstrated skill, leadership, or resourcefulness could attain influence beyond what had previously been conceivable. In this evolving landscape, the meaning of status and authority shifted, emphasizing contribution and capability alongside tradition. Ultimately, the social shifts following the Black Death were not the product of a single decision or event. They were gradual, subtle, and emergent, arising from necessity, loss, and adaptation. Communities learned to value each member, to negotiate power and labor, and to maintain cohesion despite demographic upheaval. Families adapted, neighborhoods collaborated, and cities restructured themselves around the realities of scarcity and survival. Through these processes, the social fabric of Europe transformed, laying the groundwork for changes that would continue to unfold in the centuries to come. Life after the Black Death was marked by reflection, adjustment, and quiet resilience. Survivors carried memories of loss and the lessons of survival into their daily interactions, influencing how they worked, cared for one another, and structured their communities. These social transformations, though often subtle and slow-moving, were profound. They reshaped the experience of family, labor, community, and authority, creating a society that, while scarred by tragedy, was also more flexible, aware, and resilient. The echoes of the Black Death lingered in streets, homes, and fields, in rituals, markets, and workshops. They influenced the relationships between neighbors, the responsibilities of families, and the expectations of labor. In this period of rebuilding, the importance of cooperation, resourcefulness, and mutual support became clear. Communities that had survived together learned to value both the individual and the collective, recognizing that social strength was essential to enduring the challenges of life in a post-plague world. Through all of this, the human spirit persisted. Social structures, though tested and sometimes strained, adapted. Families, neighborhoods, and cities found ways to maintain cohesion, honor the past, and plan for the future. The transformations that occurred in this quiet, gradual way were as significant as any military conquest or political upheaval, for they touched the daily lives, relationships, and experiences of ordinary people. In the aftermath of such profound loss, the emergence of a restructured and more resilient society stands as a testament to human adaptability, empathy, and the enduring importance of social bonds. After the Black Death swept across Europe, claiming millions of lives, the world that remained was forever altered not only in its population and economy, but in its culture and intellect. Art, literature, philosophy, and religious thought all responded to the shock of such immense loss. The sheer scale of death forced people to confront questions of mortality, meaning, and human purpose in ways that had rarely been necessary before. Streets, towns, and villages that had once echoed with ordinary life were now infused with a somber reflection, and this reflection found expression in every corner of European culture. Survivors, having witnessed unimaginable suffering, turned their attention to understanding the human condition, to exploring the fragility of life, and to representing both despair and hope in creative forms. Artists were among the first to translate the pervasive sense of mortality into tangible forms. Paintings and sculptures increasingly depicted the reality of death, often in stark and haunting ways. Skeletons danced in cemeteries, plague doctors were represented in masks and robes, and landscapes showed abandoned villages and quiet fields. These visual representations served multiple purposes. They memorialized the dead, reminded the living of their own fragility, and offered a space for reflection and contemplation. Unlike earlier art that often emphasized religious triumphs or courtly life, post Plague art turned inward, examining the human experience and its impermanence. The brushstrokes, textures, and shadows were deliberate, inviting viewers to pause and consider life and death in a deeply personal way. Literature, too, began to explore themes of mortality and human fragility with renewed intensity. Writers chronicled the horrors of the plague, describing the empty streets, the families torn apart, and the rituals surrounding death. Tales of survival, loss, and resilience were interwoven with philosophical questions about the nature of existence and the meaning of suffering. Poetry and prose from this period often conveyed a quiet melancholy, yet beneath the sorrow, there was a persistent search for understanding and order. Through storytelling, communities processed trauma, honored the memory of the deceased, and explored ways to navigate a world forever changed by catastrophe. Religious thought experienced significant shifts in response to the Black Death. Clergy who survived were confronted with congregations devastated by loss and fear. Many questioned traditional explanations for suffering, pondering why divine providence allowed such widespread death. Sermons reflected both reassurance and caution, emphasizing moral conduct, repentance, and the fleeting nature of life. Pilgrimages and religious observances became more prevalent as people sought both comfort and meaning. Some individuals, however, began to explore spirituality outside the bounds of established doctrine, seeking personal understanding and experiences that transcended conventional religious structures. This intellectual exploration, subtle yet profound, laid the groundwork for the questioning and innovation that would flourish in the Renaissance. Universities and centers of learning faced their own transformations. Many students and teachers had perished, leaving gaps in knowledge and instruction, yet this loss created opportunities for innovation. Scholars sought to rebuild and expand curricula, emphasizing empirical observation, careful record keeping, and critical analysis. Medical knowledge, in particular, gained new attention as physicians attempted to understand the causes of the plague and develop preventative measures. Although understanding was limited by contemporary science, the rigorous approach to observation and documentation marked an important shift in intellectual methodology. Education became more experimental and attentive to the natural world, laying the foundation for future scientific inquiry. Public discourse also reflected intellectual engagement with the plague's consequences. Town councils, guilds, and other civic bodies debated policies for labor, trade, and health, demonstrating an emerging awareness of human organization and governance. These discussions were often informed by observation, experience, and a desire for stability. People began to recognize that careful planning, record keeping, and reasoned analysis could mitigate suffering and improve societal outcomes. In this sense, the intellectual impact of the Black Death was not confined to abstract thought. It influenced practical decision-making and social organization in profound ways. Philosophers and thinkers responded to the plague by questioning long-held assumptions about life, society, and morality. The unprecedented mortality forced reflection on the impermanence of human achievements, the role of fate, and the value of ethical conduct. Some explored existential questions about suffering and the nature of divine justice. Others emphasized human responsibility, encouraging communities to care for one another and to act with compassion and prudence. This intellectual ferment was quiet at first, often expressed in personal writings, letters, and local discussions, but over time, it contributed to a broader cultural re-examination of values and priorities. Artistic expression extended beyond painting and sculpture into architecture, music, and craftsmanship. Buildings were designed with attention to light, space, and durability, reflecting both practical needs and aesthetic sensibilities shaped by a heightened awareness of mortality. Churches, chapels, and civic buildings incorporated symbolism, that reminded visitors of the transient nature of life, encouraging reflection and reverence. Music, too, evolved to convey both grief and hope, with melodies that were mournful yet uplifting, guiding listeners through contemplation and catharsis. Craftsmanship, from textiles to metalwork, demonstrated a careful attention to detail as artisans sought to create objects that would endure, carry meaning, and honor those lost. The Black Death also prompted a reassessment of knowledge and expertise. Traditional authorities, whether in medicine, religion, or governance, were challenged by the scale of the catastrophe. Communities increasingly valued individuals who demonstrated practical skills, observation, and innovative thinking. Physicians who experimented with new treatments, scholars who recorded empirical data, and leaders who implemented effective policies gained recognition and influence. This subtle shift encouraged a culture that valued evidence, creativity, and adaptability, paving the way for intellectual movements that would transform Europe in the following centuries. In literature, narratives of death and survival were often interwoven with moral lessons and philosophical reflections. Authors explored the impermanence of wealth, the vulnerability of power, and the unpredictability of life. Stories of ordinary people navigating loss, scarcity, and fear provided both guidance and comfort, illustrating resilience and human ingenuity. Through allegory, metaphor, and reflection, writers helped communities interpret the chaos of their world, offering insights that were both practical and deeply contemplative. Reading, storytelling, and oral tradition became mechanisms for cultural continuity, preserving knowledge while fostering collective understanding. Medical knowledge, though still primitive by modern standards, advanced through necessity. Physicians documented symptoms, experimented with treatments, and sought patterns in disease transmission. Communities implemented rudimentary public health measures such as quarantine, sanitation, and the isolation of affected households. Observation, record keeping, and careful analysis became tools for survival. Although the causes of the plague were not fully understood, these practices marked an important intellectual shift toward empiricism and rational problem solving. They demonstrated that human observation and thoughtful intervention could mitigate the impact of disaster, laying the groundwork for future advancements in science and medicine. The intellectual landscape was also shaped by increased literacy and access to texts. With social mobility and labor shortages, some individuals found new opportunities to pursue education and learning. Manuscripts were copied, knowledge was shared, and local libraries and monastic collections became more significant as repositories of cultural and intellectual heritage. Reading and study were no longer confined to elite circles. A broader segment of society engaged with ideas, contributing to a gradual democratization of knowledge. This intellectual engagement strengthened communities, encouraged critical thinking, and fostered cultural continuity amidst upheaval. Art, literature, and intellectual inquiry were not merely reflections of grief. They also inspired hope. Amidst the devastation, individuals sought meaning, beauty, and connection. Paintings depicted serene landscapes alongside scenes of mortality. Stories celebrated courage, compassion, and ingenuity. Music and poetry provided solace, offering listeners a gentle rhythm through which they could process sorrow and embrace life. These creative expressions nurtured resilience, reminding survivors that even in the shadow of tragedy, human ingenuity and spirit could flourish. Philosophy, literature, and art intersected in ways that enriched the cultural fabric. Discussions of ethics, mortality, and human responsibility influenced artistic themes, shaping narratives and imagery. Ethical considerations informed governance and community organization. demonstrating that intellectual reflection had practical consequences. The blending of creative and analytical thought fostered a holistic understanding of human life, one that acknowledged both suffering and potential, loss and renewal. Communities, in turn, absorbed these cultural and intellectual developments. Public ceremonies, festivals, and commemorations incorporated artistic and philosophical insights, creating shared experiences that reinforced social cohesion. Education, storytelling, and artistic production became intertwined with daily life, embedding reflection and awareness into the routines of ordinary people. Knowledge was not confined to books or scholars. It became a living part of community identity, shaping behaviors, values, and aspirations. The long-term impact of these shifts became evident in the Renaissance. While the immediate aftermath of the Black Death was marked by grief and recovery, the intellectual curiosity, creative experimentation, and cultural engagement that emerged laid the foundation for a period of extraordinary innovation. Artists built on earlier techniques, philosophers questioned assumptions, and scholars pursued knowledge with renewed vigor. The resilience and adaptability demonstrated in response to the plague influenced every domain of life, shaping societies that were more reflective, observant, and engaged with the world around them. Even small acts of intellectual or creative expression carried significance. A painter depicting the quiet beauty of a recovered village, a writer recording the experiences of ordinary families, a scholar analyzing patterns of labor or health, each contributed to a cultural memory that honored the past while preparing for the future. These incremental contributions created a rich tapestry of knowledge and reflection, demonstrating that even amidst devastation, human thought, creativity, and curiosity could thrive. Education, artistic production, and intellectual inquiry became intertwined with survival and adaptation. Learning was not abstract, it had immediate practical applications in medicine, agriculture, governance, and craftsmanship. At the same time, creative expression offered emotional sustenance, providing a medium through which communities could process grief and envision hope. The dual role of intellect and culture, as both practical and restorative, shaped post-plague society in profound and lasting ways. Artistic innovation, literary exploration, and philosophical inquiry continued to evolve, creating connections across regions, social classes, and disciplines. Ideas were shared, techniques refined, and insights documented, forming a cultural network that transcended the immediate trauma of the plague. This interconnectedness encouraged collaboration, experimentation, and cumulative learning, fostering an environment in which human creativity and intelligence could expand despite, or perhaps because of the earlier devastation. Ultimately, the cultural and intellectual impact of the Black Death was both subtle and pervasive. Communities, families, and individuals responded to loss with reflection, experimentation, and expression. Art memorialized the dead and inspired the living. Literature explored human fragility and resilience. Philosophy questioned assumptions and encouraged ethical consideration. Education, scholarship, and observation expanded knowledge and skill. Together, these developments nurtured a society that was more aware, creative, and capable of responding to both human suffering and potential. In the quiet years following the plague, as streets gradually filled again and markets reopened, these cultural and intellectual currents persisted. They influenced daily life, informed decisions, and enriched social interaction. Communities that had survived the Black Death carried the lessons of mortality, resilience, and reflection into their art, literature, and thought. Through these subtle yet profound shifts, the human spirit asserted itself, demonstrating that even in the aftermath of immense tragedy, creativity, inquiry, and contemplation could thrive, guiding society toward a future shaped by both wisdom and imagination. The Black Death left an indelible mark, not only on the population and economy of Europe, but also on its understanding of health, medicine, and public organization. The pandemic had revealed the vulnerabilities of communities to disease, and it became painfully clear that traditional approaches to health were insufficient. Streets littered with the dead, homes abandoned, and hospitals overwhelmed. All of this underscored the urgent need for new strategies, both medical and civic, to protect populations. In the quiet aftermath, survivors began to reconsider not only their personal health, but also the structures and policies that governed communal well-being. Medical practice, which had long relied on ancient theories and limited empirical observation, faced unprecedented challenges. Physicians were confronted with a disease they could neither prevent nor cure, and this failure prompted reflection, experimentation, and adaptation. Though knowledge of pathogens was non-existent, doctors began to observe patterns of symptoms, the progression of illness, and the impact of environmental factors. Careful record-keeping, previously uncommon, gained importance. Notes on patient histories, descriptions of symptoms, and the outcomes of various treatments became valuable tools, helping to gradually build a foundation for more systematic approaches to medicine. Hospitals, rudimentary by modern standards, struggled to cope with the influx of patients during the plague. In the aftermath, communities recognized the necessity of organized care. Efforts were made to maintain hospitals, provide trained caregivers, and create systems for isolating the sick. The concept of quarantine, though still evolving, began to take root as a practical measure to prevent the spread of disease. Entire households suspected of infection could be separated from the healthy population, and travelers from plague-affected regions were sometimes confined for weeks. These measures, though primitive, represented an early understanding of disease prevention and the importance of public health intervention. Communities gradually developed a heightened awareness of hygiene. Streets, which had often been filled with waste and refuse, were cleaned more regularly. Wells and water sources were monitored for contamination. Households adopted basic practices aimed at minimizing risk, such as the disposal of waste and the careful storage of food. Though the germ theory of disease was centuries away, these practices reflected a growing recognition that environmental factors could influence health. Observational knowledge, gained from tragic experience, informed everyday decisions and slowly shaped communal standards of cleanliness. Physicians and scholars also began to question prevailing medical theories. For centuries, European medicine had relied heavily on Galenic principles, balancing the four humors to maintain health. The sheer scale of mortality during the Black Death highlighted the limitations of these ideas. While treatments remained largely ineffective, the failures encouraged critical thinking and the search for alternative explanations. Some physicians explored herbal remedies, dietary adjustments, and other interventions, documenting outcomes and sharing observations. This gradual accumulation of empirical knowledge contributed to the slow evolution of medical understanding in the post-plague era. Local governments and civic authorities recognized the need for structured responses to public health crises. Town councils began to issue ordinances governing waste disposal, the isolation of the sick, and the movement of people during outbreaks. These early policies reflected an understanding that communal well-being required regulation and oversight. While enforcement varied and compliance was often imperfect, the principle that collective action could mitigate disease became increasingly accepted. The foundation of public health in its earliest form was being established through practical necessity Informed by the experience of widespread suffering, quarantine measures in particular became a cornerstone of post-plague health policy. Ports and trade routes, which had facilitated the spread of disease, were monitored, and travelers were often detained to ensure they were not carriers of illness. Entire households or neighborhoods suspected of infection were isolated. Though the understanding of contagion was incomplete, these measures were based on careful observation of patterns, such as clusters of illness following travel or trade. Communities gradually learned to implement these practices systematically, balancing the needs of commerce, daily life, and disease prevention. Medical institutions, including hospitals, monasteries, and universities, played key roles in shaping post-plague health practices. Monastic communities, which had often served as centers of care and record-keeping, contributed knowledge about herbal remedies, care protocols, and hygiene practices. Universities began to emphasize the study of medicine, anatomy, and observation, cultivating a new generation of physicians who approached their work with a more analytical mindset. Although progress was slow and uneven, these efforts laid the groundwork for systematic medical training and the gradual development of more effective treatments. The experience of the plague also reshaped societal attitudes toward illness and caregiving. Families and communities recognized the importance of caring for the sick and maintaining the health of vulnerable members. Women, in particular, played crucial roles as caregivers, managing households, tending to the ill, and supporting communal health practices. Their knowledge, accumulated through practice and observation, became a valuable resource, contributing to both family survival and broader societal resilience. In addition to immediate medical and hygienic measures, there was a growing emphasis on understanding environmental factors that influenced health. Observations about water sources, waste management, and living conditions informed policy and personal practice. Communities began to recognize that crowded living spaces, poor ventilation, and contaminated water could exacerbate illness. While the scientific mechanisms were not yet understood, this practical knowledge encouraged more thoughtful urban planning, housing arrangements, and community organization. These subtle changes improved living conditions and reduced the likelihood of widespread outbreaks in subsequent generations. The Black Death also prompted attention to nutrition and sustenance as factors in health. Survivors, aware of the link between food scarcity and vulnerability, focused on cultivating crops, preserving food, and managing livestock carefully. Dietary habits, while still shaped by cultural norms and availability, reflected a cautious awareness of their impact on overall health. Food preservation techniques, storage methods, and careful allocation of resources became integral to household and community survival, illustrating the interconnectedness of nutrition, environment, and well-being. Civic authorities, recognizing the economic impact of disease, increasingly saw public health as a matter of policy. Healthy populations were essential for labor, trade, and economic recovery. This practical consideration reinforced the importance of measures such as quarantine, sanitation, and healthcare provision. Over time, these policies evolved into more formalized systems of regulation, surveillance, and planning, reflecting a growing understanding that governance and health were closely linked. Communities began to see that proactive measures could protect both human life and economic stability, creating a foundation for more systematic approaches to public welfare. Medical practitioners also explored new methods of communication and education. Public notices, town criers, and simple manuals disseminated information about symptoms, treatment, and precautionary measures. Awareness campaigns, while primitive, helped communities respond more effectively to outbreaks. Knowledge was shared not only among physicians and scholars, but also among the general population, fostering a collective understanding of health risks and mitigation strategies. This emphasis on education and information marked an important step toward more organized and responsive public health systems. The role of observation and empirical study grew in importance. Physicians and caregivers noted correlations between certain behaviors, environmental conditions, and illness. They experimented with different treatments, diets, and hygiene practices, carefully documenting outcomes. Although many interventions were ineffective, the habit of observation, recording, and analysis created a culture of inquiry. This intellectual approach to medicine encouraged systematic thinking, laying the groundwork for future advances in medical science and public health. Community organization became a critical aspect of health management. Neighborhoods and villages developed informal support networks, coordinating care, sharing resources, and monitoring vulnerable individuals. Local leaders, whether secular or religious, often assumed responsibility for organizing relief and implementing preventative measures. These networks, while decentralized, were remarkably resilient, allowing communities to adapt quickly to emerging threats and ensure a measure of continuity and safety in daily life. The Black Death also influenced the development of specialized roles within healthcare. Physicians, midwives, apothecaries, and caregivers each contributed unique skills and knowledge. Their collaboration, often informal, enabled communities to pool expertise and respond more effectively to health crises. This division of labor and specialization enhanced the capacity of societies to manage disease, setting precedents for professional medical hierarchies and structured healthcare systems in later centuries. Psychological and social factors were also recognized as important to health. Grief, stress, and fear had tangible effects on physical well-being, influencing recovery, immunity, and resilience. Communities developed rituals, support systems, and coping strategies to address these challenges. Religious observances, communal gatherings, and storytelling provided emotional sustenance, helping survivors navigate trauma and maintain social cohesion. These practices reinforced the understanding that health was multidimensional, encompassing not only the body, but also mind, spirit, and social environment. Epidemiological observation, though rudimentary, began to emerge as a field of inquiry. Scholars and physicians documented patterns of spread, seasonal variations, and the impact of human movement on disease transmission. These observations informed both local policies and broader strategies, contributing to a slowly expanding body of practical knowledge about contagion. While the mechanisms were not yet understood, the habit of systematic observation created a foundation for future scientific study and the eventual development of public health theory. The economic consequences of disease further reinforced the importance of health policy. Labor shortages, declining productivity, and disrupted trade underscored the interconnectedness of population health and societal stability. Authorities recognized that investing in prevention, care, and sanitation was not merely a moral imperative, but a practical necessity. Communities that successfully implemented health measures recovered more quickly, stabilized labor forces, and sustained economic activity, demonstrating the tangible benefits of proactive management. Even small innovations, such as improved water storage, waste disposal, or household cleanliness, had cumulative effects. Families and communities that adopted these measures were better able to avoid recurring outbreaks, maintain productivity, and support one another. Knowledge of these practices spread through observation, word of mouth, and the writings of scholars and physicians.